everyone. My name is Christina Greenfield, and I am with Emily Rachal, the co-founder of Malachi's Message. Today, we have the extreme pleasure of interviewing Josh Rachal, who is an expert and the president of Texas Mold Inspectors. Texas Mold Inspectors is a company that specializes in forensic litigation-based assessments, as well as mold assessments for the hypersensitive. Josh is licensed as a mold assessment consultant in the state of Texas and is also certified as a master inspector. He has performed over 2,000 mold assessments and has personally been involved in representing his clients in over 120 individual cases regarding mold exposure and property damage. His company, Texas Mold Inspectors, was created after his own family went through and experienced mold, which severely injured himself, his family, and resulted in the death of their dog and their second son, Malachi. Josh now travels the country to help attorneys and their clients, as well as patients of doctors that refer him. Thanks for being with us today, Josh. We're so excited to talk to you.
That's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Welcome, Josh. The first question that we have for you is, you're a mold assessment consultant with the state of Texas. You travel all over the country as an expert, but what separates you from others? What truly makes you an expert? What's the difference?
It's more of a designation by the courts. I guess what separates me, though, from other mold inspectors that claim to be experts is I actually end up testifying. And also, I tell the truth. One of the biggest shocks that I have experienced when dealing with other experts, just creating rebuttals against these other experts, they're hired, let's say, by the defense or even by the plaintiff side to create a narrative that, let's say, there's no mold. So that's been one of the biggest shocks. So what separates me from them is I just tell the truth. There's no mold, then I say there's no mold. But if there is, I will find it. So I guess I wanted to throw that out there just because I used to hold someone who is, let's say, deemed an expert. I used to hold them in extremely high regard, but that's not the case anymore. Because I know, I guess, the other side of experts and what they're hired to do, regardless of their credentials or their experience. That is what is so shocking to me.
I think that's a really, really important point, because as just a regular homeowner, just a few years ago, who didn't know anything about this world yet, we relied so heavily on people that we regarded, just like you said, we held them in high esteem, and we thought, these people are the experts. They're the experts in the HVAC. They're the experts. We had an inspector, we had air quality tests, we had plumbers. All these people that came into our home year after year to do our normal maintenance, to answer questions when we actually figured out that we had an issue. And no one said a word, no one said a word. And I don't know that that's because, in that instance, it's not because they were, had some ulterior motive necessarily, but I think that people don't answer questions that you don't ask, certainly. And as uninformed consumers, we didn't know the questions to ask, on our normal maintenance things. I told somebody the other day, we purchased 2 of those UV light things to be put into our AC unit in our mold house. Hired a company, licensed HVAC company to come put it in. They didn't say a word about the mold. And it was compacted in the unit. It was so visible. We didn't ask. Of course, we didn't know that it was an issue, but they didn't say anything. Right. So it's like it's a complete mind shift that you would have to be so diligent as a normal consumer, unlicensed in these very specialized areas, to know that you have to be able to advocate for yourself. And then particularly when you get into the cases that you're involved in, because very few cases actually make it to litigation. So I think it's such an interesting perspective that you bring, because so many people are kind of relying on, but they're licensed. They're going to do what they're supposed to do. They're going to tell me what they have to tell me, everything that I need to know. And it's not the case. And particularly, I'd like to hear about your experience with new builds, but I have my own experience with new build issues, but I think that in those cases, the consumer can very easily rely on, oh, it's a brand new building. Oh, they had their own third party inspectors and I was able to see the results and that's all I need to know. But I think that ties very well back to your point where, they have a narrative. There's a story to tell that they're hired to create.
Yes, and you're bringing up a good point, though, especially with new homes. I get this all of the time where, let's say, my clients, first thing they tell me is, well, I had an inspector or the city inspected it. Oh my gosh, get me started on city inspectors. I don't know what they do, if anything at all,
Yeah.
other than say they showed up and, signed some document.
Mm-hmm.
But when it comes to home inspectors, a home inspector should not be relied upon to determine whether or not you have mold or not.
Right.
In fact,
they're looking at what's visually not to code, and code is the very minimum standard, right?
correct, but I've read so many home inspection reports where probably within the first paragraph or three, they'll say this is not a code compliance inspection. So,
Right.
just trying to reduce their liability any way possible.
Sure. Which causes an issue for the consumer, because if it's a new build issue, the builders are saying, probably we'll fix something if it's a code issue. And then many inspectors come in and they're like, we're not speaking to code.
They're not even looking for it. That is so true. But it comes down to, what is the person hired for? Who hired them? So, if I'm going against, if I'm, let's say, building a case for a client, the defense in any situation, they're going to hire an expert to prove their side almost.
Right.
And
yeah. That's exactly why they hire the expert.
It's shocking to hear these experts of, let's say, 40 plus years, industrial hygienists that have some kind of mold certification from, let's say, California. It doesn't matter. It's shocking to hear what they say. Mm-hmm. And it's very disrespectful, actually, when we're considering the health of, let's say, the plaintiffs. In most cases, when there is litigation, they are complaining about, let's say, adverse health effects from the mold. Well, it comes down to facts, and it's a matter of collecting the data in a way which proves the facts are just that, factual. And a lot of times it's proving location. I have to, just with each photograph, it cannot just show my moisture meter, let's say, on a wooden floor or on some drywall. I have to show 3 or 4 photographs before that photograph that sets my location within the home, marker location, basically. And then I have to, it's almost like creating a video, but I'm using still photography. But also, just as a backup, I also wear body cams to show everything in true time, real time. And again, just telling the truth.
Yeah. Which is when it becomes a question of what is the law, what is the contract, and builders and the people on their side are very strictly trying to stick to the limitations of their own liability. And then you're coming in with the real-time data, the real-time facts, and you're with your body cam and the way that you're taking the pictures and everything. It's so conflicting in a person's mind, because like you said, you're telling the truth. You're not fabricating anything. You're going in and you're telling the truth. And then the other people on the other side are trying to find a way to make the puzzle fit the limitation of their own liability, which necessarily is not the truth.
Correct.
And so it's I think that contracts, law, liability, people think that there's a right and a wrong. They think if you're following the law, then you are doing things the right way. If there's a contract, then they are going to do things the right way, and it's just not true.
Correct. Very correct.
There's no correlation there between right, wrong, and legal.
Yes, and even the legalities get twisted and tweaked in any way possible to where interpretation of the law now starts to, let's say, play a dominant role in a case, as opposed to, again, the facts. And what are the facts? So I do keep it simple when it comes to the facts. I show it, I find the mold, prove why it's growing where it is growing, and all my photographic evidence or video evidence speaks for itself.
Why do you think though, because there's so many people out there that are, in Texas, you have to obviously qualify and be licensed to do mold assessments, but in other states, anybody can pretty much say they're a mold inspector and go out and do mold inspections because nobody's there regulating them. There's no qualifications needed. Why do you think the majority of inspectors, though, that do mold inspections don't do what you do? Why aren't they willing to do what you do? And why aren't they as thorough as you as well? Because you have many examples where you'll go into a house where inspectors already cleared it and said, there's no mold here, but then you go in and you're like, nope, it's actually the opposite. There's a really big mold problem here.
And it's shocking. I guess I'm not shocked anymore just because I see it so often, but it happens all of the time, meaning it doesn't matter the state I was in, but this particular client had 2 other inspections before they finally had me out there. And so when I arrived to the home, I met, the husband, I met the wife, talked to them a little bit, got to know them, and I walked back outside because I started on the outside of the house typically. I was outside of this home probably an hour and a half because of all of the issues that I was finding. And, again, this is a way that I'm different from other inspectors, but 90% of what I do is my assessment of the home, breaking down the home, searching for the mold. But a lot of times I don't even see the mold on, let's say, a surface. So if I don't see mold on a surface, then I am then assessing or inspecting for environmental conditions that are conducive for mold to grow. And the majority of the time, searching for environmental conditions, that's all invisible to the naked eye. It is. So it's a in-depth understanding of construction, building sciences, understanding the tools and devices that I have to utilize on site. And I have to not only trust the measurements that I am receiving from those devices, but I also have to have an in-depth understanding of how those devices work, such as a psychrometer, hygrometer, moisture meter, thermal imaging camera, just a few as an example. But so, back to the question was, why don't other inspectors do it the way I do? And it might be an overgeneralization for me to say this, but let's say I performed assessments like the majority of other inspectors. I could knock out 6, 7 homes in a day easily, and then really be held accountable for almost nothing. Because if I were to do that, focus on volume, then I would also just rely on air quality samples. Air quality samples are by far the most unreliable method for determining whether or not someone's home, has a or multiple sources of mold. Completely unreliable. In fact, and let's say an air quality sample does show elevations when compared to the outside air sample, which is going to be used as a reference. Let's say the indoor air quality does have any elevations. It still will not tell us where that mold is coming from. It's impossible to know where that mold is coming from just based on an air quality sample. And unfortunately, I would say the vast majority of inspectors, consultants, IEPs, or industry professionals, they rely on air quality sampling. So yeah, I can knock out 6, 7 homes in a day, but am I doing a service that I'm being contracted to do? And the answer is no, if I just did that. So I assess the home, in my opinion, the way people want me to assess their home, meaning I look for the mold, I find the mold. Even so, when I find environmental conditions conducive for mold growth, then I go deeper. Then I'll stick a borescope inspection camera into the wall to confirm my measurements are true and confirm that I'm saying, based on these measurements, this is an environmental condition conducive for mold growth. So then I'll go in with my camera, which means that I don't always have to even sample for mold at all. I will find it, I will photograph it, I will video it, whatever it takes. But in litigious situations, sampling that evidence is, I would say, very necessary.
Right. Yeah, because somebody could say, if they're looking at pictures of mold on framing, for example, if you stuck your borescope through the wall and you happen to, see the 2x4, the 2x6 or something, and they saw something on there, they might say, well, maybe that's dirt, or maybe that's debris, or some, a piece of insulation or something else. And then you would be able to show with your testing, that's definitely mold. Because sometimes visually, I mean, for the trained professional, visually, you know what you're looking at. But to back it up in court, you need that extra kind of belt and suspenders level of proof.
Yes, which always helps, of course. But now, being a mold assessment consultant in the state of Texas, I am qualified to visually identify mold as just that, mold. I cannot, let's say, assign a species to it, but I can say it is mold. And here's one thing I do run into quite often with, I call them corrupt inspectors, really. The experts that I go against that are hired to, validate a narrative from the defense side. And so often I run across this, which is very frustrating, where these corrupt inspectors will, in my opinion, see mold, but they will call it mold-like or a growth of some sort, but they will not test it. And so with such an action, they're basically saying that, hey, we don't have to remediate it because I never tested it. And they're not going to call it mold because they didn't test it, but it is clearly mold. That's very frustrating. And so they'll exclude, let's say, that area. Maybe it was on a ceiling next to an exhaust vent of a bathroom. They'll exclude that area from a protocol because they did not test it. And to me, that is incredibly reckless. Wow. So it's in those situations where I will, as long as I'm able to, go and sample that, let's say, growth-like substance, just to prove a point that that inspector is incapable of even identifying visually mold, which, again, a mold assessment consultant in Texas is required to do that. I should say required to do that. And if there's any doubt, then we should be testing it. So, did I answer the question?
I think you did. It's so interesting to me, the mold assessment consultant and the IEP kind of world, because you would think that they're, and again, as like an uneducated consumer, you think that there's a standard and that people that have this license, maybe they all kind of come in and they do the same thing. Can you go into a little bit more depth about how that's not actually true, and what are the minimum requirements when you have a license, if there are any minimum requirements? Like how is a consumer to know what the baseline level of an inspection should be?
So it's a very broad question, because especially when referencing minimum standards, the minimum standards themselves can be gray, when interpreted. And that's what I do run into quite often when I'm trying to, let's say, prove that, let's say, an inspector, a mold assessment consultant, performed a deficient assessment. And in my opinion, a mold assessment consultant's greatest liability is just that, a deficient assessment, meaning if we're not doing our job, then we can be held liable.
Sure. And the gray area is What is the job? How do you
Correct.
define it? Yeah.
Correct. And I can say this, I can say that it is not my job when someone hires me to assess their home for mold. It is not my job to walk in, take air samples, and walk out. That is a deficient assessment. Why? Because an assessment was never performed. That is an inspector simply walking in and performing general air quality samples, which really, again, tells us nothing. So in those types of situations, that is a deficient assessment, and textbook example of it, in fact, and that is what happens almost every day. And we have to go in behind those inspectors, and that's where it becomes challenging, because if someone has had 2 inspectors perform assessments of their home, then they start to believe that, hey, not only one company, but the second company did the same thing and came to very similar, if not the same, conclusions. Mm-hmm. And now here I walk in, it can be a bit shocking. Right. So my assessments, I've had to really cater to almost a preconceived structure of thought. I'm walking in trying to then change someone's mind. And I always say, at least thank goodness they're hiring a 3rd inspector. And I'm so happy and thrilled that and honored that it is us, Texas mold inspectors. But, you know, the communication of what I'm finding, how to communicate it, is, I would say, just as important as my assessment itself. If I am not communicating, you know, clearly, properly, thoroughly, then what I'm sharing with my client could fall on deaf ears, especially when they've had 2 inspections before me. And if my communication is not where it needs to be, then they might dismiss what I'm sharing with them. Let's say my clients might dismiss what I'm sharing with them, and they might not ever consider mold again. And I think that would be one of the largest mistakes that I could actually make. My assessments are not deficient. They are extremely thorough. On average, I'll perform 1 assessment a day. Every now and then, I'll have 2 assessments in one day, depending on the size of the home, size of the building, the structure. But for the most part, it's 1 assessment per day. And I would say sometimes after my assessment, it should take me an hour or longer to have a very in-depth conversation about what I've learned. Where is the mold? Why is the mold there? The discussion afterwards is incredibly important, vital.
I think that right there, what you just said, that is what sets you apart. That is what sets you apart from every other professional, not only in this industry, but any other professional in my experience, and just the building industry in general, because it feels like you put so much emphasis on that point, the communication point, which is 100%. It is just so, I can't even find the words. It's so important. It's so incredibly important, because you are speaking to people who don't speak this language, who haven't been in this world, who are maybe sick, probably are sick. Their cognitive function might be impaired. There might be rage. There might be discourse between, spouses or whoever's in the home. There's all of these elements that are working against you in delivering this message that could save these people's lives. And I think the fact that I'm about to cry, but I think the fact that you have been able to maintain that level of intensity through the years of doing this professional work, and that you haven't lost that you are saving people's lives with this level of communication and the level of assessments that you do, and the fact that economically there is absolutely a trade-off, and you don't compromise that trade-off, because you know that your job is so important. And so in my opinion, that is what sets you apart, you and your whole company apart in this space. Because, like you said, not everybody has to do that. Not everybody has to spend all that time not only testing every single wall, looking at things holistically and finding the conditions conducive to mold. You're not just going in looking and seeing, oh, is something wet? Okay, maybe there's mold there. You're digging deep. And it's such a service to people and families and individuals. And I'm so incredibly thankful for Texas mold inspectors and the way that you don't compromise your integrity in this space, where I think that common and normal have put a cloud over the so many important elements in this space. Because, like you said, you have two inspectors come in and they say everything's fine. They do an air inspection. You've got you come in, you do a thorough inspection, and you tell them something different. Because it's common for an inspector to come in and not do such a thorough job, but that doesn't mean that your home is healthy. That doesn't mean that you're in a normal environment. That should not be the standard.
So very well put, and thank you for the kind words. You know, and going back to what, you know, separates my assessment from someone else's assessment is, you know, I've been through mold. And just as many of us, you know, that are learning about mold or have been through mold, we have also learned that the average person, or to the average person, mold is somewhat taboo. You know, we don't speak about it. It's misunderstood. It's not known about. I would say it's more swept under the rug with intention, if anything. But for me to take the time and to perfect my trade, I've had to endure the fire of going through mold so that I'm not putting someone or a family in a situation that I was once in. You know, going back to when Emily and I were in mold, we would have loved it. We would have loved to have known that, hey, before you moved into this house, here's something you should know. You know, it flooded from the inside. And hey, we saved a ton of money by not fixing it correctly. Then Emily and I would have been able to make educated decisions based on very important information, but that wasn't disclosed to us. We would, if it were disclosed, then we could have made good decision for not only each other, but for our son, for our animals at the time. And so that's why the conversations that I have with my clients at the end is so incredibly important, meaning ask me anything. And I will not cut my assessment short because I have something else to do. I am pretty much there all day answering questions until I'm kicked out.
And
go ahead, Christina. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I've heard a couple of things that make a quality assessment like yours. It's taking time, making sure that you're taking time to do the assessment thoroughly, not relying on air samples, and the communication piece. So, you know, the opposite of that, when you're vetting your inspectors, maybe an inspector that you would not want to engage with would not take the time, would not be as thorough, would rely on air samples. What else? What are some other red flags that people should look out for when they're looking to engage with a mold assessment consultant?
I did want to expound upon the communication aspect of it, though, because it is a minimum duty of a mold assessment consultant in Texas to provide adequate counsel, in quotation marks. We have to provide adequate counsel. So having discussions is what we are qualified to do. We are required to do. But other red flags are, well, ask, let's say, the company, whoever's doing the intake, whoever's answering the call, ask them what type of samples, let's say, their inspectors typically do. Or if you can speak to an inspector before hiring them, that's best. Interview them, have that discussion with them, talk about the ways or methods that they employ during their assessment. And, what sampling methods do they use and why? And that should tell you a lot about that individual that you're looking to hire. Because again, the majority of them are going to say, we do prefer to take air samples in every single room, or as many as you're going to let me take. And if I see something that looks like mold, I'm going to swab it. Instead of me identifying, I'm just going to go swab it. Why? Because I'm going to keep charging you money.
Yeah, because all that's expensive, every single test.
Yes, yes. Meaning at the end of my assessment, especially with all of the photographs I'll have and all of the proof associated with, let's say, any or all sources of water that are leading to the areas that I have identified as being conducive for harboring self-originating mold growth, there's going to be no doubt of whether or not you have a mold problem in your home. It doesn't even come down to sampling. And at the end of my assessment, my clients know almost every square inch of their home. And a lot of times they'll know how their home was built, whether it's a new build or an old build. I'm going to break it down. But red flags, talk to the inspector if possible. If not, whomever is answering the phones for that company, they're the face of that company, just like my wife. And so she's going to know what I do. She's going to know my methods as well. And so ask whomever's answering the phone. I would say experience is important, but if someone's been doing it wrong
For a long time.
for 40 years, then what are they doing? But we're trying to make a difference. We're trying to do things the way we should, which is when someone hires us, they want us to be thorough. They want us to find out whether or not they have mold. And even when it comes down to sampling, sorry to ramble, but if I were to take a sample, let's say someone wanted me to take a swab sample of an item and find out whether or not it has mold on it, I would quickly share with them that's not the best sample to take. And quite often I do have clients that have almost instructions for how they want me to sample their home. And while I appreciate that, why? Because that means they've done a lot of research before even having me there. And so I know we're going to be very engaged, of course, and especially during my conversation at the end. But if someone wants me to take a sample a certain way, I will share with them, especially if I disagree, where that, let's say, method of sampling is not the best way to sample to determine whether or not you have mold here or there or on this or within this. So it comes down to really an in-depth understanding of what works and what doesn't. And I would say that also comes with experience of trial and error too. If I employed was especially true when I first started in this industry as a mold assessment consultant, but I hold myself accountable. So if I employed a particular sampling method to determine if mold was here or there, or let's say on something, if I knew there was mold there and my sampling method resulted with nothing, or it only came back with results that would indicate everything's fine, meaning it didn't show something really, really bad, but yet I knew otherwise, then I would go back. I would resample. That is my fault. And that's how I learned a lot, especially when I first started this industry. I learned the most effective ways to sample. For instance, if I think mold is in a wall, I get this one all the time, in fact. If I believe mold is growing inside of a wall, what goes through my mind is, why would I ever take an air quality sample 10 feet away from that wall. Why? And so with my experience, I learned this lesson, and it wasn't even mold inside of a wall. I walked into a home after Hurricane Harvey decimated Houston. I think there was a total of 8 feet of water that had flooded this home. Of course, no one was living there. But when I walked into the home, almost every square inch of every wall, floor to ceiling, was covered with mold. And of course, the same goes for the ceilings drywall. And again, this was when I was just really getting my feet wet in the industry. I took an air quality sample inside of that home, in the middle of that room. It showed better than the outside. How is that possible? Almost every square inch was covered with mold. And it was from that point forward, I stopped relying on general air quality samples. If I see mold and someone wants me to tell them what type it is, then if they insist, then I will go swab it. But I'm not going to rely on an air quality sample to do that.
Have you been sick or injured? If so, you may need to recover financially to rebuild your health and your life. Just Well Law can help. Just Well Law was started when Christina Bear's family lost everything to toxic mold. They walked out of their forever house with virtually nothing, leaving behind the family Bible, wedding albums, Lego kingdoms, and favorite stuffed animals. Over $1 million lost, 100 therapy and doctor's visits, and a CNBC interview later, Christina built the personal injury firm she couldn't find. If you are dealing with toxic exposure, catastrophic events, medical negligence, claims against the United States, military housing, or vaccine injury, reach out to Just Well Law. To learn more, go to www.well.law.
Wow, that's it. That's a really powerful example. I mean, I've always heard that air samples are unreliable, and just because you're just sniffing the air, so whatever happens to be there at that point in time, it could be all around it, but you're just kind of grabbing the air, and so you have absolutely no idea what you're getting or not getting. But I didn't realize that there could be mold on all of your walls, and it would still come back. I mean, why would anybody use that? I don't see how there could be any value in that.
Well, the other side, the other side loves to use that, because if the air quality sample is not elevated compared to the outdoors, it's like, well, then everything's fine.
Right.
Everything's good. There's no
Right.
So
wild.
Let's talk about a wall cavity sample. Something more targeted, more focused, which is something I love to do, wall cavity samples, because I'm increasing my chances of proving there's mold here. I have already, let's say, if I'm going to take a wall cavity sample, I have already determined that the environmental conditions necessary for mold to grow do exist within this wall cavity. Yeah. And so if I were to just, let's say, drill a hole into the wall and insert a wall cavity sampling tube and connect that to my cassette, then attach that to my biopump and just hit start, the chances of me capturing mold in that sample are still very low. Not near as low as a general air quality sample, but if all I did was insert the tube, connect it to my cassette, and then hit start on my pump, again, my chances are still low. And I always tell people this: people hire me to find the mold, not see if the mold shows up in my sampling. And so back to a wall cavity sample. Once I do insert the tube into the wall, connect that to my cassette, connect that to my biopump, and I hit start, typically on average, I'll run a wall cavity sample for 1 minute. As I am withdrawing the air from that wall into the cassette, through the cassette, mold grows on the surface. So if I'm doing my job, then as I'm withdrawing that air and through that cassette, I'm going to hit the wall. I'm not going to beat on it. I mean, I'm just going to agitate the surface.
Yeah.
I could use my hand. I could use anything. But if there is mold, it will be growing on a surface. And so by agitating that surface, that mold jumps into the air. And then I can draw that through the cassette.
Mm-hmm.
That's me doing my job. Because, and I'll say this, defense experts or these experts that I go against, they harp on the fact that I agitate the wall, harp on it. They think,
Really?
oh, all his sampling should be dismissed, struck. No. And I'll say this, me hitting the wall, not in a million years, will ever create mold growth inside of that wall.
Huh.
If I hit the wall and nothing shows up, then it doesn't mean there's no mold. It doesn't.
Yeah.
It just improves my chances greatly of proving that my assessment of proving that here are the environmental conditions conducive for mold to grow, within this wall. It just improves my ability to validate my assessment. But again, if nothing shows up, even after I hit it, doesn't mean there's no mold in that wall. It just makes it very hard to say that, or makes it very hard to come back with nothing. It can happen. It just rarely results in nothing.
Yeah.
If I hit it.
Yeah. So you've mentioned the environmental conditions conducive to mold, and I mean, obvious water damage, a leak, or something like that. That's clear. What are some other maybe lesser known environmental conditions that would be conducive to mold?
So I'll say it this way. For mold to grow, and when I say for mold to grow, I mean anywhere. All it needs is food, oxygen, and water. I'm not even saying mold spores when I say that, because mold spores are everywhere.
Yeah.
Everywhere. So if food, oxygen, and water are all present at the same time in a certain area, a certain space for 24 to 48 hours, mold will grow. In fact, it is inevitable. Mold will grow on glass. Think of a double pane window. Mold is capable of growing in between the panes if the seal of the window has been compromised. That will allow water to enter. I'm not talking about liquid water.
Yep.
I'm talking about water vapor, humidity. So environmental conditions for mold to grow: food, oxygen, water. And I get this a lot too from these so-called experts, where they'll say that vinyl flooring is not a food source. They'll say glass is not a food source. They're focused on the wrong things. Anywhere dust can land, anywhere dust can settle, anywhere a biofilm can accumulate, like on glass, as long as oxygen is there, which it's safe to say by default oxygen is almost everywhere, then really all we're looking for, trying to determine, is whether or not a source of water will exist. And understanding that it's not just liquid water that a mold assessment consultant or environmental professional needs to be looking for. We also need to be taking into account humidity, water vapor.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't just mean that we need to be studying a hygrometer, which tells us the relative humidity in a room. We need to understand, how is that home built? Understand the outside environment. Are we in a humid area like Texas? But now I go to very, very dry states. I mean, extremely dry states where maybe an inch of rain per year. And I might be getting off topic here, but it's not always even the outside environment. People say, well, I can just move to Arizona.
Yeah.
because there's so little humidity. And I just want to get their wheels turning because, all right, that's great about very low humidity, but we're still dealing with extreme temperatures.
Mm.
And so I'll bring up an example of, all right, let's say you just have a cold glass of water and you walk it outside in the middle of the hottest time of the year. And let's say it's only 20, 30% humidity, but it's 120 degrees, which Arizona does get that hot. What happens to the glass? And I let my client answer. And yes, they'll answer correctly. Condensation will form on the outside of the glass, but yet you still have low humidity outside. And that's dew point. And that's something my assessments do focus heavily on, which is temperature differentials that allow for dew point to be achieved. And I focus very heavily on the outdoor environment and its ability to communicate with the building envelope, meaning the wall cavities of a home, or even the air envelope, the space that we occupy in a home. That's where I break down a home to building sciences and understanding even the basic principles of building sciences. That allows me to do very, very thorough assessments. But again, 90% of what I do is the assessment. And I have to perfect that in order to do my job thoroughly, as anyone would expect. And that goes back to how am I different from most inspectors?
Mm.
And that's it.
I want to jump in and kind of, because we're on this topic, and I know Christina is very passionate about this subject too, about building sciences and the building industry. Because one of the most shocking things that we discovered, anybody hasn't put two and two together, I'm Josh's wife, when we got into the industry, is that I thought we would be going into more older homes that have flooded, but to our surprise, it's actually the newer homes that are our number one client. And a lot of people have this assumption that only older homes have mold, newer homes are safe. Can you speak more on that and why our newer homes have such an issue? And I'll just let you and Christina talk about this.
Yes, I can definitely expound upon that. But I wanted to say this too, though, about older homes. And let's take a 100-year-old home. When that home was built 100 years ago, but it didn't have windows. It didn't have an HVAC. It might have had shutters that you open almost all the time. Meaning those homes are built for constant ventilation, constant airflow. But now, when I'm assessing those homes, let's say a month ago, I assessed a home that's 100 years old. It's not going to be as it was built originally. No, or it has most likely been remodeled multiple times. And now we're throwing energy efficient windows and doors into a home that was designed originally for constant airflow, constant ventilation. So now by retrofitting it, trying to make it energy efficient, we have created an issue where we're trapping water vapor, humidity, or of course liquid water if we have a busted pipe, things like that, but we're trapping it inside of this home now. So most of the time, homes like that, unless they're properly remodeled, retrofitted to be then energy efficient, which most of the time they're not, they're going to grow mold. But now, talking about newer homes compared to older homes, let's talk about the drywall. The paper that is on both sides of drywall, just the paper alone has changed, meaning today's drywall, newer drywall, the paper backing, facing on both sides, it has so many more adhesive, bonding agents, chemicals in general, when compared to older drywall. And now all of these chemicals that are added to the new drywall's paper, it exponentially increases mold growth, exponentially. I can go into a home with new drywall versus, let's say, a 50-year-old home. Doesn't have to be 100 years old. They didn't really use drywall back then, but I'll find sometimes double the mold growth on a new home that, let's say, it's a year old versus a home that's 50 years old because of the paper. Now, of course, we still need paper, of course, is cellulose, so it is food. In fact, a great source of food for mold. But of course, we still have to have oxygen and water present. Just having paper alone will not allow mold to grow. You have to find the water, basically. And but
which, I mean, the speaking of the water vapor, I mean, you're creating water vapor just living in the house, cooking, bathing, sweating, just being. You're creating the vapor, and you know, and not understanding how to properly use your exhaust systems. You know, that's also not going to help. But I don't think a lot of people really appreciate that. They might think, well, I can maybe they don't think about it at all. I mean, we didn't, you know, years ago. But and then there's all these, I mean, from what we've seen a lot of new builds. We were looking at brand new builds, and then we tried to alter our strategy, and we're looking like pre-pandemic builds, thinking maybe they didn't have some of the supply chain and labor issues and stuff. But we're seeing all these fresh air intake systems and we're in Texas, you know, and some of these systems that we're seeing are hardwired into the HVAC to where they're running at particular intervals, but doesn't necessarily mean that it's running when the system is cooling, which is when it would be dehumidifying. So then you're pulling all of this excess humid air into a system that's not prepared to dehumidify. So it's getting wet, and there's, for people that don't know, and Josh, please expand on this, but there's insulation inside of your plenum, inside your HVAC, which is also a great food source for mold.
And you know what, with what you just said, it's all extremely important. I get this a lot because the insulation inside of your plenum, supply plenum, that's going to be a fiberglass duct board. I hear it all the time, especially from, let's say, a builder superintendent wanting to say that, hey, everything they did is great. Well, that's fiberglass, Josh. That's not a food source. Just like the insulation in the attics, it's not a source of food. And while that may be true, that fiberglass duct board inside of our supply plenum is just like a sponge, extremely porous. So we're bringing in all this fresh air. A lot of the time, that fresh air is not even going through a proper filter, unless there's a media filter, you know, after that fresh air supply. But dust will still make it through even a media filter. That's assuming the media filter has been installed properly and there's no air gaps around it, above it, or below it. But
big assumption.
Yes.
With today's building standards.
But now, if we have dust that is able to collect inside of the supply plenum, again, it will start to accumulate and almost cover or work its way into that fiberglass ductboard quite easily. And so now, with the introduction of fresh air, if we're providing too much fresh air, and it happens so often, that means we're also providing a lot of humidity, water vapor. And if we are providing more than the HVAC unit is capable of dehumidifying, then we're overloading it. And now we're almost dumping water into a supply plenum where we have plenty of food, because dust is settling on this fiberglass ductboard and mold begins to grow. And the supply plenum is an area that we do not have access to. Meaning a supply plenum should have standard, I believe. At a minimum, it's an access panel, approximately 8 inches by 8 inches square, insulated door. They should come standard in every new build or every new HVAC system in general. But I mean, Christina, you and I are discussing the supply plenum, which, look, if an AC system has an issue with mold, I would say the majority of the time it will be inside the supply plenum. I'll also see it inside of the the internal drip pan, which is beneath the condensate coils, but again, we can't see inside there.
Yeah.
Rarely do I find it in the return plenum. Rarely do I find it inside of ducting. So I will see it quite often inside of, let's say, a supply register, where, let's say, your duct terminates with, let's say, the ceilings drywall in a bedroom. That's your supply register, the area behind the vent cover. Quite often I'll see it in there if there's an issue with the efficiency of the HVAC system, or an issue with even building. And that's when I'll catch it inside of a supply register. But I guess the point I'm trying to get to is, we just, briefly discussed a couple or a few different areas or ways that mold can grow in the HVAC systems that we're using. The problem is, there are probably dozens of other ways that mold will begin to grow inside of an HVAC system, because there are so many accessories, components, methods of installation that are required for a properly installed HVAC system. As long as all of those installation methods and accessories and components are all, for one, compatible, but installed properly, designed properly, then we should not have an issue with mold inside of our HVAC systems. But unfortunately, that's not my experience with dealing with even new homes. Typically, and again, this is based on my experience, but you'll have an HVAC company. And let's say they have a contract with the builder, fine. Typically, it's the owner of the HVAC company that holds the license. And that owner of that HVAC company is not doing all these installs.
Yeah.
The employees are. The employees do not hold the license. Because I guess if I thought about it, if the employees had a license, they'd probably go start their own company. And so it's literally unlicensed individuals assembling the lungs of our home, which are so incredibly important. Because if those lungs, our HVAC system, becomes contaminated, we will not see it. And we will not always smell mold. In fact, olfactory sense, smell, relying on smell to determine whether or not a problem with mold exists is just as unreliable as a general air quality sample. I don't rely on my smell to determine if someone has a problem with mold. But HVAC systems, I think there's so many flaws just with what we're used to. What are the consumer, what we're expecting from, let's say, the builder's HVAC company. Going back to, Christina, what you said about hiring certain professionals, let's say when looking for a home to buy, relying on a builder to do what they say they're going to do, or do what they're advertising to do. We've been conditioned that, hey, it's okay to rely on these individuals, but we shouldn't be. We need to be educating ourselves on, well, what are the common mistakes that builders make with HVAC systems, or with the foundation of a home, or with the brick exterior, or with the stucco or limestone. And we have to break down every phase of construction and really dig deep and find what are these issues that would lead to mold, or lead to other issues, maybe bacteria. But where bacteria can grow, so can mold. But so if we educate ourselves, when it does come time to build, it's not so we can catch the builder having made a mistake and say, hey, you need to correct this. No, it's more about, let's catch that ball before it hits the ground. Let's get out in front of a mistake that might be made had I not educated myself in the first place. Because when we move into a home, when we purchase a home, we expect for that to be our castle, our sanctuary, the place that we can go and relax, because, or at least that's my stance with a home, because I can't control when I walk into a supermarket. I can't control when I walk into any retail location, commercial building, school, get me started on schools. But I need to be able to control my home, my living environment. And that's where we really have to take control of educating ourselves and not relying on other individuals to do what they say they're going to do, unfortunately.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it all comes back to money. I mean, it really does.
Yes.
I mean, the builder, the production builders, it's a numbers game, right? And they're trying to do it for as inexpensively as possible to the minimum standards required. They're not going to live in the home. You are, so their job is to put the sticks together and sell it. That's what they think their job is, anyways.
And then their contract basically screws the homeowner if there is a problem, because there's an arbitration clause. So you can't take them to court and, have a jury trial in front of your peers and let them decide, who's right, who's wrong, and what the damages are. You have to go through the long arbitration process, which is
with a tribunal who's made up of people who are from the production builder industry.
Yes.
So I mean, it's completely. I think it's important for people to think, or maybe just to reframe, because it does feel like sometimes it can feel like everything's against you. The economics of, trying to recover from mold or identify mold or figure out, how you're going to live through mold, and just people not believing. And then environmentally, mold is everywhere, hearing that. And then you do feel like an outlier when you're going and you're having these conversations with people, with builders, and you're asking questions. Well, what are you using? What's the sheathing that you're using? How are you affixing that to the framing? How are you dealing with holes in the sheathing? I'm asking these questions, and people are, taken back, and they're like, nobody has ever asked this question before. And I'm not only disappointed that nobody else is asking these questions, but it's off-putting for them to deal with a consumer who's asking these questions, which to me, I'm a big proponent of, you just let your freak flag fly, just put it out there. And then whoever isn't receptive to it are not your people. Those are not people to engage with. Those are not people to do business with, but it's like, the more that our flags are flying, the more people we're checking off the list, and we're kind of sitting back going, well, hell, like what do we do? Where do we live? Who do we work with? So I think a reframing is important, at least for me personally, to remember that, it's the game is really strategic, and it's about, like you said, Josh, getting ahead of issues, getting ahead of problems, not completely avoiding them, because understanding you can't control everything in this world. You can't. That's an impossible game. But you can control some things. You can control your sanctuary, the place that you rest and relax and recharge. You can control your family dynamic, how you treat each other inside that sanctuary. You can understand and identify where the weak parts are in your home, and you can monitor those risks like your life depends on it, because it does. But you don't have to be afraid of everything and everybody. You have to just have your eyes open. Be aware of deficiencies, be aware that, look, pandemic builds, production issues, supply chain issues, labor issues in the time of, the pandemic. I mean, I think just awareness without fear, taking that awareness and just using it, it's one of your tools in your toolbox. And then finding your people, your experts, people that that you can rely on, that welcome these conversations and don't, try to make you feel crazy or shun you. Goes all back to communication.
Yes, it does. And an understanding. And I wanted to give this example, which is after I had assessed a home for a family, I shared with them that, okay, the shower was constructed improperly. And why? Well, the builder used the wrong grout in the shower. And I proved it to them. I showed them why I was measuring elevated moisture content in the areas that I was. Meaning, we had a very long discussion about it. It was either that same night or the next day. Whether it was the wife or the husband, doesn't matter. They contacted the builder and they asked the builder, what grout do you use for your showers? And so the builder did a little research and sent her, some specifications on grout. And so I read through them. I was, that doesn't add up with my assessment. And so humbly, I asked, I think it was the wife at this point, I said, please, when you have time, go into your attic and see if the grout that is in your attic, which is always left there by the builders, see if it matches up with what the builder sent you in that PDF.
Uh-huh.
She was lit on fire when they did not match up. So we also have to verify, checks and balances. We have to verify that, hey, what they're selling me is what they're actually giving me. Because so often it is not. And here, you want to know the actual grout to use in a shower? It has to be non-absorbent. The problem was the builder in this particular home, or it could have been a remodel. I don't know. It could have been a remodel just with a normal contractor. But they used a cementitious grout, which is absorbent. Just as cement is absorbent, just as mortar is absorbent. So the building code, International Residential Building Code, many years back, states that in such areas, we have to use non-absorbent finish materials. Well, so the correct grout would be an epoxy-based grout. It does exist. I think you can go to, the local big box retail stores that, stock building materials without saying their name, and you can find epoxy-based grout. You can do a quick search for it online. When that grout cures, it is waterproof, meaning it does not absorb water or moisture. And that would, once they do that in every other, layering component of a shower, then you have a good shower. But so there are other things that can go wrong. But if water cannot migrate through the grout into areas unintended for water retention, then the chances of you having mold inside of your walls drops significantly. You could still have a busted pipe, of course, yes, but epoxy grout, that's a quick fix. And really, a builder should never have an issue, in my opinion, with using an epoxy grout. Why? It actually meets the minimum requirements of building code, for one. And hey, that would also mean that, okay, you as the homeowner buying the house from me, you wouldn't have a problem with your shower moving forward as long as everything else holds up. But for some reason, the builders still push back on that, and it blows me away. Yes, it's slightly more expensive to get an epoxy-based grout.
But aren't they subcontracting out that work to another contractor? It's not the actual builder doing that. It's their contractor who they look for a lot of times, the most affordable contractor.
And you bring up a good point, Emily, but who are you contracting with? You're not contracting with the subs. You're contracting with the builder. But yes, you're right. It is most of the time, I would say 99% of the time, it's subbed out. Yes. But
and then just generally maybe unsupervised, because again, the production, if we're talking about production build homes, like the production build homes is a numbers game. There's only so many supervisors. So if they have these subs out there who were the lowest cost, like you said, Emily, sub, they're probably the lowest cost sub because, they're either going to cut costs on material that they said they were going to use or on the labor, or both. So maybe the builder thinks, we're providing them this, we paid for this, that maybe they bring the wrong grout onto the site and nobody's looking or asking questions until it's too late and you're a consumer who has a shower that's full of mold.
And Christina, a lot of times, and I'm not speaking for the builder, of course, but they like to use their subcontractors as responsible third parties, a scapegoat.
Yeah.
They think it takes liability off them. And in my opinion, you contracted with the builder through the builder. And I believe the builder should be held responsible, or the contractor. It doesn't have to be a builder. I'm not singling out builders. I'm just saying
somebody who did the work.
Yes.
Well, I'll throw this in there because whenever I used to work for home builders, and the supervisor of the homes is typically called the superintendent. And that superintendent has typically 10, 20 or more homes that they are supervising at once while they're being built. So they can't be in every single house, during the day, making sure everybody's doing everything right. They're spread out, they're spread very thin. And I can't speak to every home builder and how they pay their superintendents, but generally they're also financially incentivized to get every home completed, so that they can close within X amount of months. If they don't, then they don't get that financial incentive, which obviously adds up for them. So they want these homes to be done as fast as possible so that they can meet those deadlines in order to receive that financial incentive.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. That makes sense.
And a lot of times, and I don't say this too often, but I do think it almost daily, as a consumer, I say it's our fault. And here's why, though. We're conditioned with buying new homes that this is the process, this is how it goes, and really there's no other option out there. But let's apply, what we're discussing right now to buying a car. If we apply these same concepts on the most simple level, then let's say I go to a luxury car dealership, mind you. And let's say I'm wanting to purchase a $100,000 car. They don't have it on the lot. So they say to me, we're going to order it. We'll have it here in 3 months. And so let's say that dealership takes this big old box of parts and pieces, components, accessories, all with that shiny logo that I'm paying for. And they go to, let's say, a local auto parts store, and they find some guys hanging out, and they say, hey, here are all of these parts and pieces and components to build this car. I'll pay you this much money. You build the car. No, you don't get any instructions to do it. And they say, okay. So they build the car. 3 months later, I show up to pick up my car. Let's say it's Cadillac. You think I would take that car? Not built by the manufacturer, not having met all of the safety requirements. I mean, everything must be fine-tuned. And I'm just talking about a Cadillac. No. Most of the time when I ask this of my clients, in this scenario, would you even get behind the wheel of that car and see if it runs correctly or drives correctly? No, we would not stand for that for 1 second. But yet we're doing it with our houses, the very place that we are to live in and breathe in, and it needs to be healthy, but we're doing that with our houses. I said socially conditioned to think this is correct the way we're buying houses. It's not. It's also not correct how we're building them, obviously. And it does, like Emily said, that arbitration clause that's egregious. That is unconscionable, if you ask me. It shocks me. But understanding all of these issues and pitfalls, then we can educate ourselves on how to get out in front of that problem before it becomes an issue. And I know it's easier said than done. I do know that. But it's possible. And it just takes someone diving in with both feet to learn it all. And sometimes having that knowledge means change. And it's also human nature to deny change, or at least at first onset. But as long as we're educating ourselves and understanding that the changes is for a betterment of our health and our family's well-being, then I say it's well worth the change.
Great. And then and just going back to getting the right people on your side, contracting with people who are like-minded, who believe like you believe, that a healthy home is necessary, required, and possible. And then, partnering with people who share that level of education to the consumer. I think that's important, and that you just can't spend enough time vetting the professionals that you're going to do business with, especially with something so important as your home.
And like you said, the vetting process is important because so many, look, whether it's a doctor, whether it's a builder, it doesn't matter what profession, they're going to try to market themselves and become desirable by the consumer to get the business. So a lot of times as a consumer, we'll mistake that for being like-minded. So that's where the vetting process is so incredibly important. But in order to properly vet someone, we have to then educate ourselves before that, so we know what questions to ask. And we have to understand that sometimes the answers we're getting, we have to understand it's snake oil, meaning incorrect and a lie. So I'm not going to say it's easy to navigate in the environmental industry, but it does take a good knowledge base, and then vetting, and like you said, Christina, like-minded individuals that are proven. They have proven track records, and will also take the time to answer the questions and explain the process and explain everything, so that communication is accepted, it's understood. And now, for instance, when I communicate, I'm passing on the information to them. I cannot fix the problem, but I'm passing on the information that my clients are able to take and then act upon. Meaning, never once do I try to just, after an assessment, deliver bad information, or let's say bad news, which sometimes can be devastating. I also offer solutions to where I find mold, if we were to consider that bad news. But in a lot of situations, it's also the most sought after news that we need when we cannot find what it is that is, let's say, causing adverse health reactions or conditions. So even though so many times they're nervous when I'm assessing their home, they'll tell me that, they'll share that with me. It's not just bad news I'm going to give them, because yes, it is good news. That's why they hired me. But there are also solutions. Does it always require formal mold remediation? Not always. But at the end of all of my assessments, that discussion will take into account, especially if someone cannot financially afford to remediate all of the mold, then we have to manage it. And, what are the best ways to do that? And at the end of most of my assessment, there's no longer anxiety, meaning we have a deeper understanding and we have a deeper respect for not only mold and what it can do, but just also how they can start to assess their own home. They don't have to call me every time, meaning they are now empowered with knowledge and a know-how on how to assess their own home, which is very, very important.
And that certainly doesn't have anything to do with the minimum requirement of being a mold assessment consultant or IEP. That's above and beyond, but that just goes to show how passionate you are about doing good work and changing what we see as common in the industry. And I think that's good work.
I will add this. We have also learned, because we get called out a lot after someone does an assessment, like, we just need you to look at the HVAC system. Like, why didn't the other inspector look at your HVAC system? The majority of mold inspectors will not look at the HVAC system, and that is the lungs of the home. And so they're calling our company because they know that Josh will look at the HVAC system, and they just want him to go out and do the HVAC system. And I'm like, we're not just going to go out and look at the HVAC system, because we can't attest to what the other inspector did or did not find in the rest of your house. So if you want us to take responsibility and liability for your home to provide you with the full picture and the answers, we have to look at your entire home, including your HVAC system. And when we do that every single time, we find obviously a lot more problems in the house than the other inspector. But that's a great way to weed out a lot of mold inspectors, is just ask them, are you going to look at my HVAC system? Are you going to look inside the plenum box? And then 2, are you going to show me what you found before you leave my house, so I fully understand what you actually assessed and what you found and why the problem is there and so forth. If you want to add anything else, Josh, you can.
No, perfectly said, of course.
Well, I know we've gone over the hour for the interview, and we didn't even get through all the questions that we wanted to ask you. So we're going to have you back on to ask you the remaining of the questions. So if you want to, contact Josh or learn more about him, you can go to texasmoldinspectors.com. You can also go to the Instagram account, Texas Mold Inspectors. And also Christina Greenfield, she's passionate, what do you call yourself, hobbyist of building sciences?
Yeah. Yeah,
also a great resource.
Like to study building science.
Find her at Rebuilding Revival, and where else?
That's it on Instagram or Facebook, Instagram and Facebook. Yep.
Yes, she's great resources too. So thank you, Josh, seriously, for coming on and sharing all the wealth of knowledge that you did, and we're going to have you back on.
Definitely an honor. Thank you both so very much.
Absolutely. Thank you. Bye.